Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and with me today, of course, is co-founder of The Gaggle, Peter Lavelle, host also of RT's talk show Crosstalk. Well, the situation in Ukraine seemed to be getting rather tense. Um, various US officials are coming out making all sorts of rather belligerent sounding statements. So we've had uh, statements from Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, the Defense Department, all of which speak of America's unwavering commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. They all talk about Russian aggression, and they bring up the issue that Russia is replenishing its forces on its border with Ukraine. Of course, they don't mention the violations of the ceasefire that are taking place in the east, which is coming from the side of Kiev. And they don't mention the belligerent noises that are coming from Kiev. So, as the Western media reported, Russia is being extremely aggressive, and the US officials are responding to Russian aggressive steps. Um, so, we know how these things play out in Washington. Very soon there will be a drumbeat. Why is the Biden being so soft on Russia? Why doesn't he do more? Um, at this stage, we don't know whether war is likely to break out there. We know that the other day Putin had a video conference with Merkel and Macron, in which they obviously discussed Ukraine. And then in Peskov, when he was speaking later about the call, he said that, well, Putin didn't bring up red lines because Merkel and Macron already know about the Russian red lines, which is quite a serious statement to make. And then Lavrov yesterday in an interview said that if there is an offensive in the Donbass, it will lead to the destruction of Ukraine. So very serious talk from Russia. But in Washington, there seems to be a weakness at the top. And so I think the situation is dangerous. Okay, Peter, what's your take?
Well, and of course, we just recently, President Zelensky made it very clear that he's given the permission of the military and other forces to regain sovereign control of what we call the Donbass. This is very serious business. This is essentially a declaration of war. The military forces are being readied, and that's why Russia is readying its forces. Okay, this is a reaction to something, not an action in isolation, which is never reported in the media. Zelensky is essentially thrown in the towel here because he ran on a platform of reconciliation, of bringing the country together. He could not have gotten the vote that he had if what we would call Russian speakers or people that are not necessarily in line with the ideas of the Kiev regime that took power in spring of 2014. Basically, they gave him a shot. They gave him a chance, okay? And of course, since Zelensky is captured by oligarchs and is not a free agent on his own, he is caved, and there's a lot of pressure on. He's actually made himself into a pawn, into an anti-Russian policy. So he's captured, he's cornered, and so and this was inevitable. I mean, if you lose all these options, then he's going to basically say, "Do what you will," and hopefully our American friends will be at our back. Now, we have all of these calls or statements from the State Department and the National Security Council, the Pentagon, that they support in unflaggingly Ukraine's sovereignty. Well, no, Ukraine's sovereignty is already in danger, and that was a result of the illegal overthrow of the government in 2014. That's why Ukraine has the problem with Crimea. That's why Ukraine has the problem with with the Donbass. Okay, it's another reaction to something. Russia did not overthrow that government.
Right.
Victoria Nuland, who's back in power, was part of that.
So I
Okay,
think it's right. And I think that's
Jake Sullivan,
right.
who was in power, was part of that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Now the thing is that why the situation is rather dangerous is that what might the Americans be saying? The Americans might be saying, "Hey, let's ease the situation. Let's lower the temperature. Let's relax the tensions. Let's negotiate." They're not doing that. Instead, they're wholeheartedly in support of Ukraine, the Kiev regime, and in blaming everything on Russia and making it out in a very dishonest way, that this is a war between Ukraine and Russia. Russia is being aggressive toward Ukraine. Russia is not adhering to the Minsk Accords,
which is not a signatory to.
Not a signatory. It is simply a guarantor, as is France and Germany. So that's what the Americans are saying. This is why it's a very dangerous situation. Instead of, they could be lowering the temperature. Instead, they're raising it.
Well, obviously, the timing should be of no surprise to anyone. This is the early days of the Biden administration. Biden has Obama's B team, this national security team, leading his administration now. Jake Sullivan, Anthony Blinken, Victoria Nuland, as I already mentioned. I mean, they look at this as unfinished business. Trump, dropped the ball on Ukraine. Okay, and so, what we are looking at, I'm actually very pessimistic, George. I think there is something will happen here. I really do.
I can't agree. Yeah.
When it was called the anti-terrorist operation that Poroshenko spearheaded, it was an absolute catastrophic disaster for the Ukrainian military. I mean, it was a humiliation. And so we have to keep in mind, everyone, if we obviously Crimea is off the table. I mean, if they start a military offensive against Crimea, it is war. Okay, it's as simple as that. There's no negotiation on that at all. Okay, that would be an attack on the sovereignty of the Russian Federation. Russia will react, and it will use every means necessary. And they will be unapologetic about.
Well, I think the same thing applies for an offensive in the Donbass. I mean, I think
yes, because
that's a red line. That's a red line because these are essentially Russians, and Russia's position is the same as the position of Turkey was in 1974 about in Cyprus, following the coup in Cyprus. They have a right to invade Cyprus in order to protect the Turkish Cypriots. Now, we leave aside the legality of what Turkey did, but nonetheless, that was Turkey's position. Same position as India held in 1971 when the Pakistani government sent in its forces to crush the rebellion in East Bengal and said, "Hey, the Bengalis are our people. We have a right to intervene to save the Bengalis from the Pakistani army." Russia's position is exactly the same. We will not allow the Russians of the Donbass to be crushed by Kiev.
All the more so, George, is that up to 14,000 people have been killed in the Donbass. Okay. I mean, you're going to believe any overture from the Kiev regime? No, not at all. Why should they? Okay, we have to point out is that last year there was a new ceasefire put into place. It was more or less holding as these things do. And with the advent of the Biden administration, all of a sudden we have all of these violations. The administration is telling me that the Russians are looking for a fight. Really? Really? Okay, because who's going to be the victim? It's going to be the people of the Donbass. So they are prepared. They know what they're up against. They've had to deal with this before, and the U.S. is saying that the people of the Donbass should make nice to Kiev, a regime that has killed up to 14,000 of their people. I mean, this is nuts.
Right. No, that's exactly right. Now, if you think about the Biden administration, now for them, they are so hostile to Russia, they're so belligerent toward Russia, they figure that it's a win-win for them, whichever way it goes, that they figure, okay, if there's an offensive, Russia intervenes, Ukraine is defeated. However, it's an absolute disaster for Russia because it means that all hopes of a rapprochement with Europe are gone for a generation, or business trading relations with Europe are gone for a generation. So Russia would be completely isolated in the West, and that's would be the alternative. Either Russia does nothing or Russia is defeated, then it's wonderful. So that's I think their calculations, a very dangerous calculation. Now, on the other hand, they have to think about if Ukraine is defeated, what happens in Washington? Because then the Republicans are just going to go absolutely haywire. I mean, they're going to say, "You sold out the Ukrainians. You've done nothing. Total. What a wimp. If Trump had been around, Russia would not have dared to do this." So that would be a major political disaster in Washington.
The Ukrainians would become the new Kurds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the argument the Republicans made stupidly about Crimea. Obama lost Crimea. Who lost Crimea? Obama lost Crimea, as if somehow America ever had Crimea.
Well, you bring up, this is like three-dimensional chess, because right now, the French and the Germans, and particularly the Germans, are not going to want any military adventure. They're not going to say, Zelensky, attaboy, go ahead. They go, no way, don't do anything. The status quo is far better than what could happen. So Zelensky is going to be, he's going to have to trust Washington, and that doesn't work out very well most of the time. And then, but you're going to have this sense of alienation. The Europeans are going to say, why do we have another war on our continent that never should have happened in the first place? Okay, we don't have to get along with the Russians, but we don't need this a new status quo. I mean, and also NATO is going to be put to a test, because you're going to have the hotheads in Washington. They can say, what do we have this alliance for? Okay, flip the switch. Let's flip the switch. Let's do it. And you get a lot of people saying, no, we didn't sign up for this.
Right. No, I think so. And I think that when you said pessimism, I do think that because there is such weakness at the top in Washington, and there is such hostility. There was never such hostility towards the Soviet Union, that even at the lowest points of the Cold War. When you think of the last days of Stalin, the Khrushchev and the Berlin crisis, things did almost lead to war there, but it was never that hostile. But what's now coming from Washington, what's coming from London, and to an extent from Canada too, is just unremitting. I mean, this seems like they seem to be almost spoiling for some kind of a serious confrontation with Russia. That's why I think it's a very dangerous situation.
Well, also too, we don't know what's going through these airheads in Washington. I mean, I really can't overstate. I mean, we're looking at real lightweights. This is varsity team, okay? And again, like I said, many of them feel this is unfinished business. But let's say the U.S. does falter, okay? What does that tell a lot of people in the Pacific Basin? The Americans, they're paper tiger. See, what is this? Is it? Of course, you've painted a pretty pessimistic scenario on all outcomes for all scenarios when it comes to Russia. I agree with you, but if the United States doesn't back up its own words, then it's even NATO is going to say, "Oh, why are we spending all this money? They keep telling us, but they don't do anything." See, this is just as much of a quagmire, intellectually speaking, for Washington, because George, we all know once the first shot, it leaves the barrel, then it's all chaos, okay? You can't control what's going on. And given what they've done in the Middle East in this century alone, I mean, who should you be worried about?
No, I think that's right. What's interesting. I mean, what's the American position? American position is as always, we will fight to the last Ukrainian. I mean, that's it. It's like, in 1956, we will fight to the last Hungarian. I mean, they are not going to go to war over this. I mean, Maybe now it could be that the people at the top in Washington are now so insane that they're actually willing to risk what earlier generations of U.S. leaders weren't willing to risk. I mean, that's a possibility. You know, you don't know what goes on in the minds of people like Newland and Sullivan and so on. So that is a possibility. But for NATO, the NATO bureaucracy, I mean, this is just a manna from heaven. Thank you. Now we're going to have, I don't know how many tens of billions are going to pour into NATO coffers. We've got to be strong. We've got to, resist the Russians. So again, it's from their point of view, it's win-win.
Yeah, but I mean, I think
catastrophe. But for NATO bureaucracy, two thumbs up.
I'm glad you're making the differentiation, the NATO bureaucracy, because I don't think the member states of the EU and even all NATO members are not really on board. I mean, you have this Atlanticist class inhabiting the European Union and NATO. They are keen on this because for them it's like what is it? A card game or a board game, okay? Because it let the Americans do it. We'll just we'll cheer them on, okay? Because they're not going to. NATO has really no muscle to it whatsoever, okay? I mean, they spend enormous amounts of money on soft power. I think I sent you this article. Now they have a NATO parliamentary section.
Right, the parliamentary assembly, exactly. They're going to be hunting down. They're always keeping up with the Americans. They're sort of hunting down, I guess, critics of NATO. I mean, because they're a threat to the security of the West. They might all be Russian bots and Russian agents. So so that well, I mean, that's all. You're right. I mean, that's NATO's rationale. Oh, climate change. Let's see if there's a NATO angle to climate change. So they're battened onto climate change, just like they battened onto women's rights or.
Yeah, they have their own diversity counselors.
Right.
Okay?
Exactly. Yeah.
My sense is there's a sense of foreboding here because, like we said in the very beginning here, Russia's reacting to these machinations and hoping for the best. But all outcomes are negative. I agree with you. Yep. But it also, in looking, if this were to come to pass, then Russia will complete its turn to the east. Okay, it will be. At least we'll have some closure. Okay, because you're absolutely right. Even before this impending situation, even before, is that I have said repeatedly, is that good West-Russia relations are gone for a generation. And you're absolutely. I mean, this would be the nail in the coffin. It will be done.
Right. No, I think so. And if one takes a kind of a longer-term view of this. The NATO expansion and that whole way in which NATO scooped up all of the Soviet Union's allies, satellites, or whatever you call them, during the Cold War, they scooped them all up. Russia is almost completely isolated from Europe. I mean, it's really been pushed east, really, going back hundreds of years. I mean, so Ukraine was really pretty much it's really last kind of. Stand in as far as exerting any influence in Europe is concerned, which is why Ukraine always was so pivotal to the West, and they were desperate to scoop up Ukraine, and that's why they keep still talking about Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration. They all use that phrase. They were using it this week, Euro-Atlantic integration. We know what that means. They want Ukraine in NATO, and that's what they're absolutely determined on. And for Russia, this is an existential matter, just like Crimea. The thought that these clowns who took power in 2014 in Kiev, the first act would be to try to push Russia out from Crimea and essentially push them out of the Black Sea. So these are existential issues for Russia. I mean, there's been a historic geopolitical shift against Russia over the past 25 and 30 years. The Russians just cannot afford to lose anymore.
Yeah, well, when somebody tells you who you are, you should believe them. Okay, the Russians have made their position very clear. Okay, it's up to the United States and its allies to take those words on board, because we're playing with a catastrophe right now.
Right.
Because this is a red line. Okay, if there's any kind of military operation against Crimea, the reaction will be fierce and harsh and quick.
Right. Well, I think that there would be, if there was a serious offensive in the Donbass as well. I mean, the odd violation of ceasefire here and there, no. But if it's a major offensive, then the reaction. The problem is that, how do you step back? I mean, there doesn't seem to be any voices in Washington or in, let alone Kiev. But Kiev just follows what Washington is saying. But so there's no one in Washington who is saying we need to step back. We need to, we need to end this very dangerous confrontation. To the contrary, all the voices are very belligerent toward Russia and clearly are egging on Ukraine. I mean, there was this meeting, I think yesterday, between the defense attaché of the US, UK, and Canada and Ukraine's defense minister. I mean, what's this meeting about? I mean, this meeting is, again, essentially you're egging them on. Instead of, the Secretary of State phoning up, or the president phoning up Zelensky and say, cool it, don't get yourself in over your head, no one's coming in to bail you out. Instead of doing that, they're having these meetings that are essentially just egging them on.
Well, George, look, if there is if there is an attempt, a military strike against the Donbass, number one, Russia will react instantly. Yeah, it's actually preparing for such a thing as we speak. There's no denying of that, okay? And the Ukrainian military will suffer a complete and utter defeat. It will be utter, and they know it, okay? Because the last time they tried it, it was a rout. Now, do we have to think what would happen? Russia would intervene into the Donbass? I think yes, and I'm only speaking for myself. Would it go beyond the Donbass? We could use the Georgia example of August, September 2008. Once South Ossetia had been secured, the Russian military went further into the heartland of Georgia. And basically what it did is it just destroyed military and intelligence installations. I mean, the NSA it has been estimated that the NSA lost $1 billion worth of equipment because, of course, the Russians knew where it was. So they just went in, destroyed it all, and then quickly went right back up into South Ossetia. We could see something very similar if this were to pass, which God forbid. I don't want it to do, but I'm being very pragmatic here.
They could also take more territory than just simply the Donetsk and Lugansk, because there are other territories which are part of Ukraine today that have large Russian populations.
Kharkov
will come in and say, hey, we're protecting the Russians because we're afraid that there might be a retaliation taken against Russians. So, Russians like to punish. I mean, you act aggressively, Russians will punish you. It's not just restitution. It's not like, oh, let's just go back to the status quo ante. They will punish you for instigating this. So just as much as in Georgia, what did they do? They immediately recognized the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So in this case, they will punish Ukraine. I mean, certainly they will incorporate the Donbass into Russia proper. It'll just be integrated within Russia. But I think they will even go beyond that. I mean, they will take additional territories where Russians are substantial.
Well, I don't know. Going into, I don't know how you're defining that. I mean, demilitarizing it, quite possibly, yes, obviously, okay. But I mean, if you go into the center of Ukraine, it's one of the, and this is what I
don't think I'll go that far. But I mean, it's
but let me finish here.
Yeah, no, like Mariupol.
The further you go.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, the further you see, this is basically, if we have the map here, and this is west and this is east. As you go west, you have you have a very high percentage of people that are ethnic Russians, but the further you go, that percentage goes down like to 70%, 60%, 50%. And this is the thing that the Russians have been painfully aware of, because people have always asked me, and I've argued about this for years with people, why didn't they just go and smash the regime in Kiev? And I said no, because there would be a legitimate perception that non-Russians were under occupation, and Russia is acutely aware of that and does not want to. It doesn't want to rule over people that don't want to be ruled over. Okay,
no,
it's that.
No, I think that's right. But I'm just thinking more around Mariupol. Some parts of it where there was fighting in 2014, but nonetheless did not become part.
Well, and of course that would secure the Black Sea.
Exactly. So I think that's a possibility. It would be an absolute catastrophe, obviously, for Ukraine. Look, it was an artificial construction, and when Stalin added all these bits and pieces to it, I mean, he assumed that the Soviet Union would be there forever. Once it disappeared, this artificial construction became harder and harder to sustain. And so in retrospect, you think, well, Stalin made a major blunder. He added bits to Ukraine that really couldn't live with other bits of Ukraine. Well,
I mean, in retrospect, it was a huge blunder, but at the time, it was a stroke of genius. I mean, you see this all through the Caucasus. You have all, and when you look at all of the Bolsheviks, okay, all of them tried to, the leaders, they all were the intellectuals, they were cultured, and Stalin was a thug, okay? A smart guy in a common sense way, okay? I wouldn't say he was an intellectual like Bukharin or Trotsky or even Lenin, which I'm not so sure. But Stalin understood the way divide and conquer, okay? If you want to have the Georgians and the Abkhazians and the South Ossetians get along, keep them at their throats and make Moscow the arbiter. Okay, that's how he did everything.
Right. No, I think that yes, I think so as well. But it went together with a kind of Bolshevik theory of nationalism. So long as they use their own language, they will respect their culture. But ultimately, since the most important thing is the attainment of socialism, these national disputes are really very minor. But you're right. I mean, he put all these bits and pieces together, and of course, Moscow would be the arbiter. I don't think he was a thug. I mean, I think he was a real intellectual, and I think anyone who reads his works would be struck by how very clever he was.
But I was making the comparison to other Bolsheviks. Okay.
Yeah. No,
Stupid people don't make it to the top, okay?
Exactly.
Okay, and that's the reason why he did get to the top, because all of the sophisticated Harvard and Yale types, if I can use the analogy, underestimated the guy that went from, where did Nixon go to school? He went,
he went to Duke. He went to Duke.
Well, Whitaker before.
Okay. Well, that's where he was born. Yeah.
Or LBJ went to a teacher's college. Okay.
Yeah. No, that's no. That's right. That's about that. I think that's really interesting, because now, I mean, if Ukraine loses this piece of territory, then there's going to be real problems, elsewhere in Ukraine, particularly like the Carpatho territory, because that was where a lot of Hungarians, and the Hungarians are very unhappy with this very nationalist government in Kiev, and they've raised all sorts of problems that the Hungarians are not being allowed to study in their own language, and that Hungarians being repressed. So that's going to be yet the next headache for the Kiev.
Yeah, and then you have the Galician part of it, where you have this rabid nationalism, and if you that's not there will be a catastrophe for all of Ukraine, because the sticking point, really the biggest problem that at this point in time that faces the Kiev regime is that there's part of the ceasefire, the Minsk 1 and 2 accords, was the suggestion of a special status for Lugansk and Donetsk, and for anyone outside of Ukraine would say that seems to make a lot of sense. The problem, the nightmare for the Kiev regime, is that once you award it to some, you have to award it to all. And that's when you start seeing the collapse of the Ukrainian state.
Right. No, I think so. But again, that should have been all along the objective of the Kiev regime, which is the only way you can keep this country together is some kind of a federal system, considerable amount of autonomy, and so on. You're not going to be able to hold it together if you try centralization. And again, he was given, the Poroshenko and then Zelensky, they've been given very bad advice by all the George Soros type. Oh, you need a centralized system. Don't for 1 minute allow any kind of decentralization or federalization because the terrible Russians are going to exploit it. Well, that's what happens when you try centralization. It's not going to work when you have very different people.
If you had very different people and a very different mindset, what the Kiev regime should have done is create a demonstration effect. I've also used this analogy with Georgia, is that don't attack it and kill them. Why would they want to rejoin with you if you're attacking, killing them, and putting an embargo on them, sanctioning them? Yep. Okay, I mean, like everyone watching this, understand, to get working papers, legal papers, the Kiev regime denied it. So what do people do in the Donbass? They get Russian passports, they get Russian birth certificates, they get Russian death certificates. Right. All of their financial translations are done through Russian institutions because they're not allowed to in Ukraine. So they say, you're part of Ukraine, but you can't participate inside of Ukraine. I mean, on the ground, it's obviously, you don't want to have anything to do with us. Oh, I've heard this. You said, well, if you don't want to be part of Ukraine, just leave, okay? And they're saying, no, this is where I was born. This is my country too. I'm as Ukrainian as you are. Right. But they're not, they're completely disenfranchised.
Right. Well, that's it. I mean, and, the analogy is with Bosnia in the 1990s. You remember, I mean, again, the Western powers were pushing for a centralized Bosnia. Well, there was no way that you could have a centralized Bosnia. There's no way that the Serbs were going to accept ruled by, a Muslim Croat majority. I mean, this just isn't going to happen. And there was obviously going to be war. And earlier on, there were possible peace agreements that stipulated that there would be a lot of decentralization. Essentially, Bosnia would be broken up into cantons. No, the Americans refused to go along with it. No, you have to have a centralized unitary Bosnian state. So there was a war, and you don't have a centralized state now. It's still basically a federation of two entities. And any attempt to try to centralize Bosnia would immediately restart the war. But they're using the same method in Ukraine. And it's been as catastrophic in Ukraine as it was in Bosnia.
If you look what was happening with the protest riots prior to the forced regime change, Ukraine was one country. Everyone should keep this in mind. People weren't being killed in the Donbass, and Crimea was still part of Ukraine. Now, as a result of the illegal throw of government, you shattered the country. You had the Donbass leave, Crimea leave. I mean, leave. They're gone. Okay, so you have these policymakers in the Obama administration that engineered all of this, and guess what, folks? They're back. Okay, they want another bite at the apple. Logic would dictate you screwed it up really badly, and it didn't help the Ukrainians. Okay, of course you did kind of pad your resume. Failure is never held against you. Okay, so think about it this way: the same people that screwed it up in the first place are back in positions of power. We should have no hope whatsoever they're going to do the right thing this time around.
No, that's exactly right. Newland, Sullivan, Blinken, all but had important positions in the Obama administration, and they were absolutely catastrophic. These are people, Blinken in particular. I mean, Blinken goes back into the days of Clinton. He was a catastrophe in the Clinton administration because he dealt with Yugoslavia under the Clinton administration. So these are the worst people, the people who learn nothing from their own blunders, and they're in charge. And there isn't anyone who, some figurehead who would have at least, say, look, I'm not going to listen to any of this. I'm going to cut through the nonsense. Some Trump, like figure, who up to a point he did that, but at least Trump would know I'm not going to defer to these people. But Biden, he's probably sleeping right now in Delaware, probably sleep through the Easter weekend, and Harris knows nothing about foreign policy. So this is really very dangerous. It's always very dangerous when there's no one at the top who's making decisions.
You and I have been doing the gaggle long enough. Just go back a few months. We predicted this, that they wanted to go and finish, wrap up unfinished business. We were absolutely right. Well, up until the second, we're absolutely right. Let's pray to God we're both wrong, okay? But I don't think we are.
I don't think so either. And I think that what I'm very concerned about is that Merkel and Macron, from whom you would expect, something sensible. I mean, where are they? I mean, it's very nice that they're having video conferences with Putin, but they should be actually, saying no offensive in the Donbass. It will end in disaster. We don't want it, and basically telling Zelensky, knock it off. But they're not doing it, and that means they're sorely missing. That means the Americans and the British are the driving force yet again.
And there's no downside for the U.S.
That's right. All right, Peter, we will maintain our laser-like focus. We are on Rumble. Look us up there. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. And happy Good Friday, everybody. See you soon. Bye.